In a quiet cemetery, beneath an open sky that felt almost unbearably still, a mother stood in front of a small gravestone bearing the name of a child she never got to bring home. There were no television cameras, no reality show lighting, no orchestrated family gathering. Just a woman, her husband by her side, and the kind of grief that doesn't fade with time. It transforms. When Jill Duggar shared an emotional message about visiting her late daughter Isla's grave, she wasn't announcing a project or promoting a book. She was doing something far more vulnerable. She was opening a window into a private sorrow that millions of Americans understand but rarely see spoken about so publicly. And the moment she pressed post, that private sorrow became a national conversation. For years, viewers have known Jill Duggar as a familiar face from the conservative reality television world that began with 19 Kids and Counting and later continued in Counting On. They watched her grow from a teenager in a supersized Arkansas household into a wife and mother navigating adulthood under public scrutiny. But nothing in those carefully framed television episodes prepared audiences for the heartbreak she would share in April 2024 when she and her husband, Derek Dillard, revealed they had experienced the stillbirth of their daughter, Isla Marie. Now, months later, Jill's return to Isla's gravesite and her deeply reflective message about grief has reignited conversations across social media, parenting communities, and faith circles throughout the United States. This is not simply a story about a former reality star posting on Instagram. It is a story about motherhood, loss, faith, estrangement, healing, and the complex relationship between public life and private pain. To understand why this moment resonated so widely, you have to understand the world Jill Duggar came from. Born into one of America's most recognizable evangelical families, Jill was raised under strict religious principles shaped by her parents, Jim Bob Duggar and Michelle Duggar. The Duggar family became a cultural phenomenon in the mid-2000s, representing a version of Christian fundamentalism that fascinated and polarized audiences. Their large family structure, courtship model, modest dress standards, and homeschooling lifestyle became defining elements of their brand. But as the years passed, that brand fractured under controversy, including the criminal conviction of Jill's brother, Josh Duggar, on federal child pornography charges, a case that permanently altered the Duggar family's public image and led to the cancellation of their television franchise. Jill herself gradually distanced from her parents and the strict religious system in which she was raised, describing her journey as one of deconstruction and personal growth. In 2023, Jill and Derek published a memoir titled Counting the Cost, detailing what they described as financial disputes and emotional strain within the family dynamic. That book marked a turning point. For the first time, Jill was speaking not as a daughter in a collective family unit, but as an individual. She discussed therapy, boundaries, rebuilding identity, learning to parent differently. It was raw and controversial, and it signaled that her life story was no longer tethered exclusively to the Duggar narrative. Then came April 2024. Jill and Derek announced they were expecting their fourth child. They already share 3 sons, Israel, Samuel, and Frederick. According to Jill's public statements, the pregnancy had been filled with anticipation and joy, but tragedy struck when complications arose. In a social media post that quickly spread across news outlets, Jill revealed that their baby girl, Isla Marie Dillard, had been stillborn at 4 months pregnant. She described the experience as devastating, using language that reflected both deep sorrow and faith in God's sovereignty. Stillbirth affects approximately 1 in 175 births in the United States, according to the CDC. It is more common than many people realize, yet conversations about it often remain hushed. By speaking openly, Jill entered a deeply personal and often invisible community of grieving parents. Her announcement was met with an outpouring of sympathy. Fellow reality stars, faith leaders, and everyday mothers shared messages of support. Many thanked her for normalizing a pain they had carried silently. In her recent visit to Isla's grave, Jill shared a message that many described as both heartbreaking and healing. While she did not dramatize the moment, the emotional weight was unmistakable. She wrote about how grief does not disappear simply because time passes. She acknowledged that visiting her daughter's resting place brings both comfort and renewed sadness. According to her post, she reflected on how healing does not mean forgetting. It means learning to carry love and loss together. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, her post circulated across parenting blogs and news sites. Hashtags related to pregnancy loss began trending. Comment sections filled with stories from women who had experienced miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant loss. In many of those comments, a recurring theme emerged: gratitude. Gratitude that someone with a public platform was willing to articulate emotions that so many struggle to express. Experts in grief counseling note that public acknowledgement of loss can play a powerful role in community healing. Licensed therapists frequently explain that naming grief reduces isolation. When someone like Jill Duggar shares her journey, it gives permission for others to do the same. It challenges the cultural impulse to move on quickly or minimize early pregnancy loss as something less significant. There is also a faith dimension to this story that resonates strongly in America's religious communities. Jill's upbringing emphasized unwavering trust in God's plan. Over the years, she has publicly re-examined parts of that theology. Yet, in her grief posts, she has continued to express belief in an afterlife and reunion. For some followers, that faith language provides comfort. For others who have experienced religious trauma, her nuanced tone, grieving honestly without offering simplistic answers, feels more relatable than the rigid messaging of her childhood environment. From a media perspective, this moment also reflects the evolution of reality television alumni in the digital age. Unlike the early seasons of 19 Kids and Counting, where narrative arcs were shaped by producers, Jill now controls her own storytelling through social media. She is not bound by episode structures or family approval. That autonomy allows for greater vulnerability, but it also invites scrutiny. Every word is analyzed, every photo interpreted. But to truly understand the depth of this moment, we have to slow down even further. Because grief, especially the grief of losing a child before birth, does not exist in a single Instagram caption. It unfolds in waves. It echoes through ordinary days. It reshapes marriages, families, friendships, and even belief systems. And for someone like Jill, whose life has been documented and dissected since adolescence, navigating that grief under a national microscope adds another layer of complexity that few Americans will ever fully experience. When a family loses a baby to stillbirth, the world often doesn't know how to respond. There is no casserole train quite as organized as after the loss of a grandparent. There are no established social scripts. People hesitate. They fear saying the wrong thing. And so sometimes they say nothing at all. That silence can deepen isolation. In that context, Jill's decision to revisit Isla's gravesite publicly and to articulate what it felt like becomes more than personal expression. It becomes cultural disruption. She described the visit not as a dramatic milestone, but as something tender and ongoing. She acknowledged that returning to the cemetery is both painful and grounding. That duality is something grief counselors across the United States frequently discuss, the coexistence of sorrow and solace. Standing in the physical space where a child is buried can be heartbreaking, yet it can also provide a tangible connection. A place to bring flowers. A place to pray. A place to speak a name out loud. For many mothers who have experienced stillbirth, the most painful fear is that their child will be forgotten. Pregnancy loss often lacks the public rituals associated with other deaths. There may not be a funeral attended by extended community. There may not be a lifetime of photographs. In sharing images of Isla's grave and speaking her name again, Jill was affirming something profound. This child existed. She mattered. She is loved. The American medical community defines stillbirth as the loss of a baby after 20 weeks of pregnancy, though definitions can vary by state. According to public health data, thousands of families each year endure this reality. Risk factors range from maternal health conditions to genetic abnormalities to complications that remain unexplained. In many cases, parents are left without clear answers. That ambiguity can intensify grief. Humans crave reasons. Stillbirth often provides none. Jill has not publicly detailed the specific medical cause of Isla's stillbirth, and there is no verified reporting suggesting misconduct or preventable error. By all accounts, this was a heartbreaking medical tragedy. What she has focused on instead is the emotional and spiritual aftermath, the after that rarely receives attention once headlines fade. And yet, this story does not exist in a vacuum. Jill's history with her family inevitably shapes how audiences interpret her vulnerability. Over the past several years, she has openly discussed attending therapy and establishing boundaries with her parents. She has described stepping away from aspects of her upbringing that she felt were unhealthy. That journey toward independence made her pregnancy announcement earlier in 2024 feel especially hopeful to many followers, a symbol of continued growth and joy after years of public tension. When the stillbirth announcement came, it felt like joy interrupted. Sources close to the family have not indicated any public rift surrounding the loss. There have been no confirmed reports of family estrangement related specifically to Isla's passing. But longtime observers of the Duggar story understand that Jill's support system has evolved. Her primary public anchor appears to be her husband, Derek, who has repeatedly expressed pride in her willingness to speak honestly about difficult subjects. Their marriage, once scrutinized during early television seasons, now appears to function as a partnership navigating adulthood outside the reality TV framework. Experts in trauma psychology often note that couples respond to child loss in different ways. Some grow closer through shared mourning. Others struggle under the weight of divergent coping styles. Jill's posts suggest a united front, shared visits, shared reflections. While social media cannot capture private conversations, the tone of their public statements emphasizes solidarity rather than fracture. The broader American reaction reveals something equally significant, a hunger for authentic storytelling about grief. In an era saturated with curated perfection, filtered images, and algorithm-driven optimism, raw vulnerability stands out. Jill's cemetery visit did not feel performative. There were no brand tags, no affiliate links. Just a mother writing about missing her daughter. Media coverage reflected that tone. National outlets reported on the post in measured language, avoiding sensationalism. Headlines emphasized her emotional message and her tribute. That restraint matters. Too often, stories involving public figures drift into exploitation. Here, the coverage largely mirrored the solemnity of the moment. On social media platforms, the response unfolded in layers. Some users shared their own stories of miscarriage and stillbirth, turning comment sections into impromptu support groups. Others debated theological interpretations of suffering, referencing scripture and faith traditions. A smaller contingent questioned whether any aspect of personal mourning should be shared online. That debate is not new. It echoes larger cultural tensions about privacy in the digital age. Sociologists who study online communities often describe grief posts as connective tissue moments. They temporarily dissolve partisan divides. They remind people of shared humanity. Under Jill's post, political arguments were largely absent. Instead, there were hearts, prayers, and paragraphs from strangers describing hospital rooms and ultrasound appointments that ended in silence. And then there is the long view. What happens next? For Jill personally, grief will not resolve neatly. Anniversaries will arrive. The date of Isla's birth, the due date that might have been. Those milestones can reopen wounds even years later. Many parents of stillborn children mark those days privately or publicly. Whether Jill chooses to continue sharing those moments is entirely her decision. But the initial reaction suggests that if she does, there will be an audience ready to listen. Professionally, her platform appears to be shifting further toward advocacy-adjacent territory. She has not formally announced any partnership with pregnancy loss organizations. However, historically, public figures who speak openly about personal tragedy sometimes evolve into advocates. That path is neither automatic nor obligatory, but it remains a possibility. For the Duggar family legacy, This chapter adds complexity. The narrative arc that once centered on cheerful family milestones has long since fractured. Scandal reshaped public perception. Memoirs challenged internal dynamics. Now, grief introduces another dimension, one that transcends controversy. Regardless of opinions about the family's past, the loss of a child elicits empathy across ideological lines. There is also a generational element worth examining. Jill represents a cohort of former reality television personalities who grew up on camera before they could meaningfully consent to fame. As adults, they are redefining their public identities on their own terms. Her willingness to share grief without the filter of a network production team signals a broader shift, autonomy over narrative. In that sense, this moment is not just about loss. It is about control over how and when to speak and what to reveal. For everyday Americans watching this story, the resonance may be intensely personal. Perhaps they remember a hospital bracelet tucked away in a drawer. Perhaps they think of a name chosen but never called across a playground. Pregnancy loss can feel isolating precisely because it interrupts a future that had already been imagined. Nurseries planned. Family photos envisioned. Birth announcements drafted in minds. When Jill stands at Isla's grave, she stands in that interrupted future, and by articulating it, she gives shape to something many feel but struggle to voice. Grief specialists emphasize that healing does not mean moving on. It means integrating loss into one's life story. Jill's cemetery visit suggests she is in that process of integration. Not forgetting, not pretending it didn't happen, but allowing Isla's existence to remain part of her family's narrative. There is a quiet courage in that. And as this story continues to circulate, it challenges viewers to reconsider how they respond to loss, their own and others. Do we rush people toward closure? Do we offer cliches instead of presence? Or do we allow space for ongoing mourning? In the end, perhaps that is the lasting impact of Jill Duggar's emotional message. It reframes grief not as a moment to endure and exit, but as a relationship that evolves. A mother and daughter connected not by years of shared memories, but by love that existed even before first breath. If this story has moved you, consider why. Consider who in your life might be carrying a quiet grief. Conversations like these matter because they create permission. Permission to speak, to remember, to honor. And as we continue covering stories that blend public life with deeply human experience, your engagement shapes the dialogue. Share your perspective thoughtfully. Support one another in the comments. And stay with us for reporting that treats complex stories with both rigor and compassion. Continuing this story means confronting something many Americans instinctively avoid. The long shadow grief casts long after the initial wave of sympathy fades. Because what happened when Jill Duggar visited her daughter Isla's grave is not just a fleeting emotional headline. It is part of a much larger, deeply American story about motherhood, faith, identity, and the transformation of public figures in the age of digital transparency. When news first broke in April 2024 that Jill and her husband, Derek Dillard, had lost their baby girl to stillbirth, coverage was immediate but measured. Major outlets reported the announcement respectfully, often including statistics about pregnancy loss and noting the couple's request for privacy. But as weeks passed, as trending topics shifted to elections, celebrity trials, and economic concerns, the news cycle moved on. That is how modern media works. The churn never stops. But grief does not follow the media cycle. In her recent cemetery visit, Jill made that reality unmistakably clear. Her message did not ask for renewed attention. It did not reference headlines. It did not attempt to reignite a news wave. Instead, it quietly acknowledged that months later, the ache remains. And that subtle honesty struck a nerve across the country. To understand why, we have to consider the cultural moment we're living in. Americans are increasingly open about mental health struggles. Therapy is no longer taboo in many communities. Conversations about postpartum depression, miscarriage, infertility, and trauma have expanded significantly over the last decade. Public figures speaking about private pain are often met not with shock, but with solidarity. Yet pregnancy loss still occupies a unique and complicated space. Unlike the death of a child who lived outside the womb, stillbirth often lacks external markers that society instinctively recognizes. There are no school pictures, no birthdays celebrated, and sometimes there is an uncomfortable hesitation from others about how to acknowledge the baby's existence. Jill's post disrupts that hesitation. By physically returning to Isla's gravesite and describing the experience, she reinforces a powerful message. This child was real. She had a name. She has a resting place. She is part of this family's story forever. For longtime followers of the Duggar family's journey from 19 kids and counting on, that sense of permanence carries added meaning. For years, the Duggar brand revolved around growth. More children, more milestones, more weddings, more births. The family's public identity was expansion. Life multiplying. Joy magnified.